Welcome back. I am John Pete. Today we are going to be talking about Tudor watches and whether or not these Tudor watches are a Rolex Junior, a more affordable Rolex, or perhaps even a worse Rolex. But before we jump to conclusions, I do want to say that while the watch collecting community maybe a decade ago had pretty clear cut and defined opinions on Tudor watches, today Tudor watches have really become ingrained in the collecting communities, especially as Tudor has really doubled down and tried to gain the attention of collectors. So for that reason alone, they get a lot of respect among many collectors, including collectors that shop at delraywatch.com, where we full disclosure, we do have some Tudor watches in stock, including the new Tudor Professional and some others, so make sure to check out delraywatch.com. And of course, you can find out more about me as well as some pictures of these watches on my Instagram, The Real John P. So, Tudor watches. Oh, and by the way, we're going to be kind of snipping in some video clips as well of Tudor watches that we've had or that we have had in the past to kind of share with you and show you kind of more sides of these Tudor watches that maybe you haven't seen before. So Tudor watches, are they really just a sister brand of Rolex? Well, it depends how you look at it. Yes, of course, the company that does own Rolex also does own and produce the Tudor watches, but Tudor is not a new brand. Tudor has been around since 1926 when the trademark was registered by Hans Wilsdorf, the actual founder of Rolex watches. And he had the idea to come out with a more approachable, more affordable, yet rugged, durable, and reliable really being the core term there, watch that people could purchase from authorized dealers, the authorized dealer network that Rolex had. Now, Rolex has been selling watches through authorized dealers since they were invented. That is their business model. And so Tudor was for these authorized dealers to sell, still be reliable. People needed watches back then, but Rolex watches at the time had a very high standard, much like they do today, but they were really the pinnacle at that time. It didn't really get much better than that. All these complications and things that make watches extremely, sometimes pricey today just really didn't exist for the most part back then in the early 1900s. So Hans Wilsdorf wanted to come out with a brand that could be purchased anywhere in the world among anyone that needed a reliable watch. And these watches really took off in places like Australia and places where, maybe they were still developing, not quite to what you see here today, but these watches, South Africa, let's throw that out there, different places in the world, they really took off because it was still a developing area and it was really just not the priority to be buying, the absolute most expensive watch that they could. And so these watches took off, and it was decades and decades of Rolex sharing parts and pieces and dial creation. And then when a crown would be needed, they'd use a Rolex crown. And then when they needed pushers for the chronographs, they'd use the pushers, and there'd be some sharing of cases and case parts and manufacturers, and even some cases movements. But as Tudor went on and developed and started kind of branching out into parts of the world, kind of based off these, really sub-epicenters of commerce out there in the world, away from London, essentially where Rolex was founded, these places started building out Tudor. And as the brand developed, they really didn't play in the US market. And that left kind of this gray area where Rolex really liked to focus on the US market. They just completely left that off of the table. And all these micro brands and other brands really captured what would have been Tudor's dinner, now that Tudor is starting to take back. And in 2013, Tudor re-entered the US market with watches that didn't have that Rolex co-branding anymore, didn't use Rolex parts, was completely different for the US market, now international. And they came out with a watch that we see here called the Fast Rider. Now, many of you out there, I know what you're thinking about this watch, but Tudor had to start somewhere with the US market. And in 2013, this is kind of what people wanted, right? That thick, chunky watch, that sportier watch in the different colors, the DLCs or the PVD coating. That's kind of what people wanted. So I don't think it's totally far-fetched for them to enter with a watch like this. but they did, and eventually they developed what we have today, the Black Bay line, which really has taken over the tool watch industry by storm. And interjecting my own opinion here, really has started taking the Panaristi away from Panerai and into Tudor. I've been making this claim for a few years now. I see a lot of people that probably would have been leaning into the Panerai market have gone the Tudor way for the kind of the more tool watch itch to scratch. And so that takes us into where we are with Tudor today, a separate brand, still under the house, I guess you'd call it, of Rolex, still connected, still associated, but separate, different, developing their own in-house movement calibers, creating their own technological improvements, their own designs in some cases, but in some cases shared designs, right? That's something sometimes people talk about, right? Like recently, the Ranger has come out with Tudor. Tudor has a Ranger model in the past, but now they have a different size with the in-house movement, which is really supposed to be kind of the more junior, I guess we'll use the term prematurely here, the junior version of the Rolex Explorer 1, or just the Explorer rather. But actually in just a second, I'm going to be comparing the specs so that we can actually determine, we know there's a huge or quite a large disparity or discrepancy in price points between the two, the Explorer from Rolex and the Tudor Ranger. But what does the quality look like? What are the specs? Is it really that big of a deal? So we'll talk about that in just a second. But there are some key things that I think I should share with you that I've noticed and others have noticed and are just fact in the Tudor watch lines of today compared to the Rolex watches. There are some things that are just different. Now, for example, Tudor's going to be much less expensive. That is, of course, obvious, but there's going to be less advanced technology, especially in the case metals and the movements. Now, although Tudor does have in-house movements, their movements are going to be seen in other watch brands. Believe it or not, the Tudor in-house movements are produced by a company called Kinesi. Now, Kinesi is technically a company that was started by Tudor, but they started it to sell movements to other brands. So you can find the Tudor in-house movements with a different rotor style in watches like Norqain and even Breitling for that matter. Breitling has kind of gotten away from this, but I kind of see the direction they're going with the micro brands. And Tudor has started being a movement manufacturer. And I don't think Rolex is going to start using the Tudor movements because Rolex is separate when they come out with their technology and advancements. But that's something interesting, is that the movements from Tudor are going to be seen in other watches out there on the market and probably going into the future. Now, additionally, the case angles are just less pronounced on the Tudor watches, right? If you compare something like a Submariner to a Tudor Black Bay, the cases, the angles, the chamfers, they're not going to be as defined. If you put them side by side and you do feel them with your finger, maybe run a fingernail across them, there is a clear difference in the precision of the tooling in the cases. Now, it's not a huge deal for me, and I don't think it's necessary for a tool watch especially, but some people do notice this thing, and it's something that has to be mentioned, is kind of comparably, that is the difference there in terms of the case construction. Now, the dials are also, in my opinion at least, now there might be a technological fact supporting this somewhere out there with the way that it's created, but the dials in the Tudor watches seem to be less depth provoking, I guess you would say, right? There's less depth, or the feeling of depth in most of the Tudor watch dials, a little more flat compared to the Rolex dials, where truly it can be just the most bland, basic color, but there is something with the creation and the way that the gradients are just laid on the dial and the way that it's finished. You kind of get pulled into that basic color, at least in the sunlight. There's something about the Rolex dials that are so simple yet so complicated in light. That's something I've noticed, and I don't see necessarily Tudor watches doing that. Now, there might be some out there. For example, there is a particular Tudor Royal with a blue dial that I think is just phenomenal, but it is a little bit different, I would say, than Rolex. If any of you out there disagree or agree with this, I would love to hear this in the comments below, because I know there's going to be some very loyal Tudor collectors out there that will provide examples. And of course, lastly, Tudor does outsource parts for things. The manufacture and creation of some of the parts, the pieces, especially things that go into the movements, the cases, the case metal, maybe even some of the dial manufacture. At this price point, it's just shopped out. It's shopped out to one of the dozens, or if not tens of dozens, different specialized contract manufacturers in Switzerland, whereas Rolex, for the most part, is really doing things in-house with their own technological improvements. And then when they don't, they make investments or purchase other companies that they can kind of bolt on because that is what they do. And they can afford to because they're just at a different price point. Now, modern spec, Tudor versus Rolex. Let's look at the new Tudor Ranger that was just announced. Let's look at the Rolex Explorer 1 current gen. Now, the specs are going to be eerily comparable. Very close, I would say. Now, there's obvious differences, but when we start looking at some of the specs here, right, the Tudor Ranger and the Rolex Explorer both have a 70-hour power reserve on the movement. And for the Tudor Ranger at about a $3,000 retail price, that is phenomenal. That's unbelievable. This should maybe have a 48-hour power reserve on a good day for the price point, but it has a 70, so I think that's actually really great. Now, it does have that Kinesi movement, but technically it's a Tudor movement at the end of the day. But touching on the movements, you know, the Rolex in-house movement is going to have a paramagnetic blue parachrome hairspring, and it's going to have a high-performance Paraflex shock-absorbing system. So this is going to make the watch much more protected from shock, much more of that kind of sporting watch, but not enough to where the differences are going to be very clear unless you're really exposing these things to the extreme elements in wear, right? You're bungee jumping in the Arctic from a helicopter and then getting spun around in circles, something ridiculous like that, right? To where you do that enough times, okay, it's going to start affecting the movement. But if you're sitting at your desk watching this video, or you're on your lunch break, or you're on YouTube, or you're playing games, or you're working from home, yeah, these things aren't going to make a difference if you're looking at the functionality, but some people like it because it's nice to have. Now, I have to talk about the bracelets. The Rolex bracelet is going to be better made, right? The Rolex bracelet has nearly a century, especially the Oyster bracelet, has nearly a century of iterative improvements to the construction and the manufacture of the bracelet. Look at an Oyster bracelet 100 years ago. Yes, we get into some of the models like the riveting and the folded link, but into today, it kind of looks the same. And, you know, certainly within the last 40 years, it looks the same, the style's the same, but subtle improvements, and they always come out with new ones. And that's something Rolex, in my opinion, does better than anyone else. The Rolex Oyster bracelet, in my opinion, is probably the most comfortable bracelet that exists on the market. But the Tudor bracelet is sufficient. I like it as well, but I can tell a pretty clear difference, at least in the wearability of the Tudor bracelets compared to the Rolex Oyster. But that's to be expected once again. But what do you guys think? Are there any bracelet people out there that maybe disagree? I would love to see that and hear that in the comments below. But the bracelets are also a big deal. And finally, we just have to touch on the price point, right? Look at the Ranger, about $3,000 US on a bracelet. Depending on where you are in the world, maybe even less, maybe a little more. Look at the Rolex Explorer. We're looking at a watch that's about $4,000 more dollars. $7,000 or $7,200 US was the retail price on that currently. That's a big difference, right? That is more than three Tudor Rangers. You could have a Tudor Ranger for everyone in the family or something compared to the Rolex. So when we're looking at this and we're looking at the specs and the wearability, there are some things that we can consider and trying to determine, should I get the Tudor? Does that make more sense? Is it worth it? Or should I opt in for that Rolex, right? Do I want the Rolex name? Let's think branding. But there's actually a couple of things we can look at in determining really, should you get the Tudor? Should you get the Rolex? Now, first, price is a factor. Budgeting, that's a thing, right? So price is a factor, and depending on what you're looking to do, what kind of collection you're looking to build, where you are in the world, and what so many other factors, right? But budget is number one. So if the pricing makes sense, then that's somewhere to start, and then you can kind of move on. But additionally, you have to kind of think about, what am I going to use this watch for, right? Are you going to be actually doing that thing that I mentioned in this video, flying around, in helicopters and doing kind of high action stuff? Maybe you would want the Tudor because you might actually, or there might be a great chance you're going to ruin the watch in some kind of a way. And maybe based on the price, that would be kind of a loss. You wouldn't want to do that, right? Be too much of a luxury item at that point for the Rolex. So maybe you opt in for the Tudor, still reliable, still rugged. You'll like it. Also, let's keep in mind that you should probably buy the watch that you like the most if you can afford others and the lifestyle factor isn't an issue for you. Which one do you actually like, right? Do you like the Tudor Professional, or do you like the Rolex Explorer 2? Do you like the Ranger, or do you like the Explorer 1? Do you like the Submariner, or do you like the Black Bay? Some people might actually like the bronze Black Bay or the sterling silver Black Bay, and Rolex doesn't have a comparable model. There's going to be some cross-sharing of aesthetics and design cues, but that exists in watches today anyway. So is Tudor guilty of taking or maybe even lending to Rolex sometimes aesthetic cues and styling cues more than other brands? Of course, but because they can, and they can get away with it because it's them. It's their own designs. They are them. So in summation, yes, Tudor is a more affordable Rolex in a way, but they do have their own designs, right? The Tudor Royal, they do have the Black Bay. They have their own thing going for them. And just depending on what you like, what you're looking to do, and where you are looking to be in terms of price point, really should be the driving factors in which is better for you. Maybe it's both, maybe it's neither, but that's what's great about watches today, guys, right? We can like watches, and we can share in the comments below which we like better. Maybe it's none, maybe it's both, or maybe there's something else that you enjoy, and that's what's cool about watches, right, guys? Anyway, I got to get back to it. You have been chatting with John P.